I'm Scott Beard. I am the Deputy Director for the Department of Crime Victim Compensation in the South Carolina Attorney General's Office.
And I am Fred Fletcher. I am a former police officer who served with the Austin, Texas Police Department before having the opportunity to be the Chief of Police in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where I worked actively with victim services.
And we're here to present to you on law enforcement and victim compensation.
This program, the Law Enforcement and Victim Compensation presentation, is the culmination of a long-term plan and process via the IACP to produce a series of resources to support local police departments in their effort to implement further utilization of victims' compensation funds to support their local strategies and philosophies and to support victims in their community. A core component of these resources is a series of 3 videos that were prepared to show how to effectively utilize victims' compensation funds in your jurisdictions. One of those videos is designed for each of the following 3 groups: first responders, detectives and investigators, and chief executives and commanders.
Great. So first I just want to talk to you a little bit about victim compensation. Most law enforcement officers are aware of victim compensation, but we just wanted to talk to you a little bit more about why crime victims need compensation and how we are able to use it to help victims. It's important for law enforcement to know about compensation because you are the ones who come directly in contact with every victim that we are ever going to see, because we require a law enforcement report in order to process a compensation claim. So we encourage you to learn more about what compensation is and how you can help victims' safety and healing by encouraging them to apply and benefit from victim compensation programs. So we're going to talk to you a little bit more about some of the resources that are available, and then we're also going to talk to you about some of the things that law enforcement can do and some of the things that we as victim compensation programs need from law enforcement in order to help victims together. So victim compensation has been described as a program of reimbursement for eligible crime victims and their families. We take into consideration the law enforcement report that you give us to make an eligibility determination as to whether crime victims can benefit from some of the things that we're able to offer, and I'll talk about those benefits in a minute. But the one thing that we want you to know is that the benefits that we provide to victims do not come from tax dollars. It's all from fines and fees, mostly from fines and fees on criminals. Every state and territory in the United States has a victim compensation program, and primarily it's based on where the crime occurred. So if the crime occurred in South Carolina, but the victim moved to Tennessee, the South Carolina program would handle the compensation claim. Finally, one of the things that we need to talk about with every law enforcement agency when we determine the viability or the eligibility of a compensation claim is whether a victim contributed to their victimization, whether they were contributing an illegal act or some action that they took that caused their victimization. Now, we're going to look at your law enforcement report, and we're going to look at the facts, and we're going to make a decision with your help about whether that victim is eligible or not. But we have our own guidelines that we have to use to make that determination.
Which is why gathering complete and thorough facts, which are documented in a format like a report, are vital to this effort. And it's also important for departments to understand and first responders to understand that there's a difference between being involved in a crime at the time of the injury and somebody having a criminal history. And we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit more.
Now, a lot of states follow what's called proximate cause, and we won't get too much in depth into that, but it just means that the action of the victim actually was the cause of the victimization. So Crime victim compensation is for direct victims of crime, usually physical, psychological, or emotional. Sometimes it can be for witnesses, especially around counseling. Generally, the crimes include assault, homicide, drunk driving, domestic violence, and sexual assault. There's other crimes that can be included as well, as long as it's a violent crime usually. We usually do not cover property crimes. There are a few exceptions, but most states do not. Some of the benefits that we provide are medical and dental expenses, and one important thing to understand here is that we are always the fund of last resort. So if there's some other fund, whether insurance or some other reason that there's a source that pays for a certain benefit, we have to let that happen first before we can consider whether we pay a benefit. So as I said, medical, dental, counseling, or mental health counseling, funeral and burial, those are considered together, and sometimes it's hard to pay for both a funeral and a burial with the kind of caps that some states have, but it's important to let them know that. Some victims lose wages as a result of their victimization. Often we have to have documentation of those losses. And that's something else to remember, is all of these benefits, we have to have it documented. So an example is through a lost wage claim, we might have to have a doctor's report explaining why they can't work, and we need to have some documentation that they were actually working at the time so that they're actually losing a wage. Loss of support is when a family member of a homicide victim has lost the wages of the deceased, and they come to us for the benefit of the loss that they incurred, so we support them over a period of time after that loss. Crime scene cleanup is pretty explanatory. That's handled different ways. Again, it's different ways in different states. For instance, in my state, crime scene cleanup is covered by a separate agency, but we will always let folks know where that benefit can be found. So there are some other benefits. So as I said, every state is different. A few others, relocation, especially in domestic violence cases, is offered in a number of states. Transportation, often to a doctor's office or court, may be offered. Some states offer other basic necessities. It's important to check with your state compensation program to find out what specific benefits they offer.
What does law enforcement need to know about victim compensation? Law enforcement and victims often have complementary goals in the aftermath of a trauma, which is to encourage moving forward from the incident and participation in the criminal justice process. And it's very difficult for victims of violent crime and associated trauma to continue and participate in the process in a manner that is healthy both for the victim and productive for the criminal justice system if they are concerned about basic human needs: safety, food, clothing, shelter, occupation, their family. So it's really, really consistent with both victim and law enforcement criminal justice needs. Supporting victims through victim compensation programs also supports law enforcement's goal of enhancing and improving and increasing positive interactions between law enforcement and the community, particularly people who have been victimized. It's supportive of community policing, it enhances trust building, and it builds cumulatively on the common goal of improving police and community relationships. Some states require law enforcement officers to inform all victims about crime victim compensation, and because almost universally victims have contact with either first responders or investigators, having first responders and investigators knowledgeable and well-versed in what is available and the mechanisms to access that in your particular jurisdiction provide a good opportunity to ensure that all victims receive the notifications to which they're entitled. Community policing is a widely supported and sought after philosophy and strategy in a modern police department. Supporting victims supports community policing. Like we talked about just a moment ago, it builds trust, it improves relationships, and it really establishes the ability to meet the goals that are fundamental in community policing. Community policing is police and community working together to identify problems and devise solutions to those problems using a wide variety of community and systems-based resources, building relationships, contrasting with transactional policing where it's simply taking reports and making arrests, and it is instead building on relationships and interactions between individuals and groups of people. Community policing engages resources, skills, abilities, and relationships that may not exist in a police department. It involves the community in the production of outcomes. It prepares police for unanticipated, low frequency, and potentially high risk incidents and situations. Again, it really develops social capital for law enforcement that allows a law enforcement agency to access community goodwill and community capacity in times of scalable need. And it's really closely connected to a burgeoning concept and practice called procedural justice. Procedural justice is, in essence, the concept that builds on the Peel principles of modern policing, particularly Peel principle number 2, that in order to be effective, the police need the trust and the faith of the community that the processes are cooperative, fair, equitable, and transparent. Procedural justice is just that. It says our community, our victims, expect to be treated fairly by the process and to be well informed. There's some key components of procedural justice that are very common in a victim-centered approach. They are respect, voice, neutrality, understanding, and helpfulness. And these are things that modern, proactive law enforcement professionals understand intuitively, but it's important to remind ourselves to try to address each of these components when we're supporting victims during and after incidents, but also when we're building a department policy, a set of values, and core policing philosophies.
So the Victims of Crime Act is a federal granting system where states receive block grants of money. In the past several years, it's increased dramatically, but those funds are given to each state, which then distributes that money to different agencies, state and nonprofit agencies, to provide direct services to crime victims. And for every agency that receives those VOCA funds, there are certain requirements, and those are listed here. And a lot of folks who receive these VOCA funds sign the bottom line saying, oh yeah, we'll do the conditions that are listed under our grant, but don't always read the fine print. So I'm providing you some fine print here today that says that if you receive VOCA funding, federal VOCA funding, you have agreed that you are going to do the 4 things listed here. Notify crime victims of compensation, assist with the application, assist in obtaining documentation, and this is the #1 issue for the reason that claims are delayed or denied is we don't receive the documentation. And it's part of the advocates who get VOCA funds to help victims do this, and that will help victims get their money that they deserve, and also just assisting in checking on claim status. So how can you as law enforcement encourage victim safety and healing through victim compensation? Just making victims aware of compensation is really important, and whatever mechanism you might do that through. Now, many of you have victim advocates, And so they would be a primary source, but there's some real practical ways you can do that. How do you communicate with in your community? Is it through social media? Is it through brochures or cards that you give out to victims? Is it at community forums? Any of those places are good places to have the information about victim compensation. Some jurisdictions have victim specialists who can take care of this for you. Or maybe your frontline law enforcement go to the scene, they give the information to the victim, but they also take back the information on the victim to the victim advocate, who can then follow up with the victim about victim compensation. So there's different ways to do it. We know that there's not a one-size-fits-all, but we encourage you that you as law enforcement can help victims gain safety and healing through compensation. So here are some of the other means that we talked about with victim advocates following up. But if you don't have victim advocates, and maybe law enforcement are the ones who do it, but that's important that one of the things that you let victims know about is that they can get compensation benefits.
You can also work with your complementary jurisdictions, for example, your county or your state attorney. Many victims are going to have follow-up with attorneys, and you can develop cooperative systems that are redundant and scaffolded so that more than one part of the law enforcement process, more than one part of the criminal justice system is providing this information to your victims at different times and places in the aftermath of the crime and the associated trauma.
And one other thing I was going to add was that sometimes law enforcement have MOUs with nonprofits in the community if they don't have victim advocates on staff, and those nonprofits can also provide the services and the information about victim compensation. So what do victim compensation programs need from you, from law enforcement? So again, we have to have a law enforcement report on every single claim. We can't process that claim without a law enforcement report. So that's one reason it's very, very important for us to get this message across to you, that we need thorough, detailed reports, fact-based, that address the facts of the case, that say why our victim needs a benefit. But one of the things that we talked about earlier was contributory conduct. And so we're going to look at your report to determine if the victim did contribute to their victimization, and look at it from a factual standpoint and make a determination based on the law that we have to follow. So some of the other basic things that we want you to think about when you're providing a report, I'm going to let Fred talk about.
Absolutely. It's really important to help the victim understand, in addition to the information you need from them, what the criminal justice system can provide to them. And often that is a present and accessible person to listen to what happened. And when you provide that listening ear, when you provide a good active listening environment, you're going to meet a fundamental need of the victim, but you're also going to set the stage for helping you obtain that information that you need to both do your job and to help support what Scott here just said, the victim compensation mechanism needs to do theirs. And there is nothing that the victim compensation mechanism program's presence needs that isn't present in a well-written report for the investigation. So it's important to understand that we realize how much is going on the scene of a crime, particularly a violent crime involving trauma to a victim. And there's a great deal going on. We're not suggesting that there's anything additional needed, just the cognizance that the good, thorough, fact-based observational report that you need to help work through an investigation, whether it's a field investigation or a follow-up investigation or supporting your county or state attorney, is the same type of detailed information that compensation funds need to make the decision about funding those claims. And it's also important to distinguish the difference between criminal behavior, as Scott said, that is a proximate cause in an incident, and a criminal history. That is, somebody who has been involved in crime previously can absolutely still be a victim in a current incident and qualify for compensation. That previous criminal conduct that is not a proximate cause, a criminal history, if you will, is very different from collaborative criminal conduct in the incident that caused the injury that we're documenting in the current incident. It's also important to understand that the tools that we're providing, the toolkit and the resources, are templates that are consistent nationwide. And every jurisdiction, every state has slight differences. Work with your programs, your department, the leaders in your community and your organization to make sure that we understand who the resources are that we should refer people to, both to help file the claims, to follow up, and to receive additional resources, perhaps in addition to the compensation. It's really, really important, as every police officer knows when investigating a crime, is to not promise anything that we cannot certainly deliver. It is really important both to be effective stewards of these programs, but also to be supportive of victims, that we are open and honest and transparent, and that we make references, but we don't make promises based on other people's and other organizations' decisions. Specifically, victims' compensation funds make the final decision about who can get compensated for injury related to an incident we're reporting. It's important that we let victims know that that they can reach out to those organizations, those funds, and we're going to provide the basic information, but that we are not able to make that decision, we as law enforcement. And it's also important, really important, as law enforcement, both first responders and organizationally, that we really get to know our advocates. Some of you will be fortunate enough to have systems-based advocates, that is, advocates within your organizations or within your city. Others are going to rely heavily on community-based advocates. Either way, it's important to have organizational and interpersonal relationships with those advocates so that you're able to make regular and productive references. The Federal Victims of Crime Act, VOCA as we've referred to it here, requires victim advocates to provide information to victims about victims' compensation. And again, those can be systems-based at your organization or community-based. But having those relationships will make sure that people get referred to the folks who are required and able to make that, meet that requirement. Victim advocates, both systems and community-based, work regularly with compensation programs and are going to have and should have a more thorough knowledge, and are going to be able to help victims navigate that process better and at better times and places than first responders often will. And victim advocates are often the best resources for the victim you're serving in the aftermath of an incident. That is what they do full time. It's what their training, their support, and their organization is prepared to do. And there are many of them willing to support law enforcement in providing services and care to victims in the aftermath of crime and trauma.
Once again, part of this project was to develop 3 training videos as well as sample tip cards and social media posts. And this is the website that you can go to download those videos. We encourage you to work with partners in your community to train other law enforcement, or to work with other law enforcement to reach out to victim advocates and partners in your community to get the word out. And we just believe that there's a lot of victims out there that are not getting the resources that they're eligible for. And with your help, we can reach many more of those victims.
We as law enforcement are not going to prevent or solve every crime, but we can commit to responding to and supporting victims in a manner that's consistent with our basic values and our basic goals. And that's what we've tried to provide here, is resources to help you support your community members who have been victimized by crime and violence. Bye.